join me in welcoming Jon Fox in another Conversations with the Artist.
The date is October 29, 2016. I'm slated to play a percussion concerto by Christopher Rouse. It is a wild piece. My setup took up the entire length of the stage. Marimba, electronics, drums, exotic percussion, even a drum set. Here I am on your left, hiding in plain sight. My part's really tough, but so are the orchestra parts. While I knew the orchestra could handle it, I also knew it would take a master conductor to bring it all together and bring it to life. In just a few days of rehearsal, the man who handled all the odd meters, the breakneck tempi, the changes in style was Andrew Litton. And he did it with an amazing combination of grace, consistency, intensity, and, well, actually calm. In a nutshell, this is Andrew Litton, principal guest conductor of the SSO. My name is Jon Fox. I am the principal percussionist of your SSO. And hopefully we have Andrew Litton, principal guest conductor of the SSO with us. Andrew, are you there?
I am here. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
And you are alive and surviving the times of COVID. What's that like in New York City?
Well, actually, I'm not in the city. I live in a suburb, actually in Westchester County, which was the second highest number of cases in the entire state of New York. So not out of harm's way, I'm afraid, but I've been very good about staying at home and obeying the rules. And so far, touch wood, since my last trip anywhere, which was to Singapore, I left you on March 5th. I have not really left my house. So it's a very, very strange world we live in. And of course, as you know, as a performing artist, we're going to be the last ones that get to apply our craft again, because who's going to want to get together and sit in a concert hall, with all this virus going around. So it's a very scary time. We've all been occupying ourselves in different ways. I've actually gone back to my roots, to the piano, and I've been playing piano every day and really enjoying that, because conductors don't have outlets for their musicality or whatever without an orchestra, without people to play when you wave your arms. And of course, if you wave your arms in the quiet of your kitchen, which is where I'm sitting now, nothing happens. but you
well,
can
right
go
now,
sit
none of us have these outlets.
Yeah.
I mean, when do you think it is going to be, or what will it take for audiences to come back, to be willing to come back and watch a concert?
Well, I think it's going to start very slowly, and if we're lucky, it will start sometime before December. And it's going to be maybe with social distancing seating and with the orchestra seating spread out. I don't know. I really don't know. My current job, as you mentioned, is as music director of the New York City Ballet. And we have the additional issue of the fact that dancers actually do need to touch each other. It's part of the art form. They can't socially distance and dance Swan Lake. It's not possible. So, I just don't know how we're going to move forward with it. And we're working on it round the clock, really trying to come up with scenarios. But until, we're still in lockdown in New York State until at least June 6th at this point. So, any talk of the future is a moot point at this moment, because we just don't know what the future will bring and when it will bring it. So it's very frightening as a performer, as a musician. We traditionally, whenever there have been issues historically in the past, even the Great Depression, people turn to music for comfort. And now, aside from these wonderful offerings on the internet, they can't turn to us. We can't do what we do best. And it's very hard. These are incredibly frightening and strange times. And I think in the past, maybe 2 weeks went by during a calendar year where I wasn't on an airplane. And now it's literally, my last flight was on March 5th. And
well, maybe that's a plus.
Yeah, I guess.
Not the best part of the gig.
Definitely not. Traveling since 9/11 has definitely plummeted as far as a luxury item. But no, it's still the joy of getting there and making music with your colleagues and making something come to life in, well, if it's a symphony orchestra in the space of a week, if it's an opera in the space of several weeks. But I miss that so much. I think we all do. But interestingly, I've been talking with a lot of my conductor colleagues and even seen some other interviews on Facebook where none of us have opened any scores. It's like we're too somehow detached from that act to actually, sure, I could be spending this time learning Parsifal, which is something I always wanted to do. I can't do it. I'm just not motivated. I need a reason to be, which is why I'm so happy for the piano, because it really has sort of reawakened a side of me that I'd let lapse.
Well, let's talk about that piano, because you started on piano, right? So when you were really young, this was your first baby, piano. So
that's me. That's me sitting on my father's lap. I was I didn't start at that early age, but I did start just before I turned 6. And I was an incredibly shy little kid. And so my mother basically chose the piano teacher because we went to talk to 2 of them and I didn't know. And I remember that there was a very wonderful family-run chocolate shop. This is way before the age of designer chocolate. Like nobody had heard of Godiva, or Toy Shore or any of those. But there was this very famous chocolate shop just 30 meters from where my piano teacher happened to live. And so that was a bribe. She said, I'll get you a chocolate-covered marshmallow. I love their chocolate covered if you go take this lesson. And so 2 things resulted. I became a musician, and I'm a little fat, but it worked. I actually fell in love with the piano. I loved the fact that I could express myself. And I was never been an athletic type, but, even in elementary school when athletics aren't that important, the fact that I could do something and do it quite well and everybody would gather around the piano and say, play, play, that was awesome. And it completely brought me out of my shell. And I was very happy with the piano until about the age of 10. I started going to the young people's concerts that were then given by Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic. And it would make a much better story if I could tell you it was the first concert I went to and I was like, oh, I want to be a conductor. No, it was maybe the 4th or 5th one. And he did a program called Anatomy of an Orchestra. I remember it to this day. And the piece was The Pines of Rome, which, John, as you know, is an incredibly visceral, dramatic, romantic, loud, beautiful piece. And to this, well, I guess I was 10 or 11, I was completely captivated. And of course, Bernstein did such a marvelous way of describing the 4 vistas that Respighi sets in this piece. And I just walked out of then Philharmonic Hall, now David Geffen Hall, the 3rd name in my lifetime, and said to my mother, who always picked me and my little friend up, from the concert, Mom, I want to be a conductor. And to this day, I remember she rolled her eyes like, yeah, whatever. And I was, the problem with her, not that she was at all insensitive, she was amazing. It's just that up till that morning, I wanted to be a fireman. So she didn't really take it very seriously. But I was very serious. And I was very fortunate in that closest friend of my parents happened to be Richard Horowitz, the timpanist at the Met. And some of our listeners may remember him. He's the longest serving principal player of an orchestra in history, to our knowledge. He was at the Met for 66 years. And so he basically said to my mother and father, all right, I got this. I'm taking care of this. And, he's going to be with me from now on. And it was so fun because literally as soon as I got my homework done and my piano practice done, I'd run over to Lincoln Center, which was 5 blocks away, very close, 7-minute walk. And I watched usually three shows a week from the pit next to the timpani, between the wall and the 30-inch drum. And
so what's the difference aside of the volume, sitting in the pit as opposed to sitting in the audience?
Yeah, Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I've been lucky because my parents both loved music. My mom sadly is no longer with us. So I went to things. I mean, I saw so many. John, you'd appreciate this because you did your stint on Broadway. I went to so many first cast Broadway shows that are now legendary, like Fiddler on the Roof and Mame and all of sorts of Hello Dolly. I saw the original casts of all of these. That's how old I am. All right, I was a little kid, but still. And it was the same at the Met. But now suddenly I had the vantage point of being in the orchestra. And of course, a little 11-year-old doesn't know when all the loud subito fortissimo timpani rolls come crashing in, particularly in Italian opera, when somebody's been discovered to be a traitor or unfaithful. So Dick Horowitz would always go, psst, and I'd grab my ears. And it was great. Obviously, 3 or 4 years later, I knew when they happened in Tosca and Carmen and Aida and whatever. So I didn't need that. I just knew when to cover my ears. But by the time I was 13 or 14, I could read a score quite well. And so he actually set me up with my own lit music stand. So I don't know what people thought if they actually looked in the pit. Like, who's this kid behind the tuba player right next to the timpanist? But it was the most amazing education because I obviously night after night, same orchestra. Back then, they didn't have all this huge pool of musicians, basically the same players night after night. I'm talking about the 1970s, by the way, just to give everybody a historical reference here. And I couldn't believe how differently the same musicians sounded, depending on, obviously, the piece, but also who was conducting. And there was the education. I learned so much by watching. And actually, conducting is a vicarious art. You basically do have to learn, mostly initially when you're starting out, by watching, because no orchestra is going to say, oh, kid, you look cute, come conduct us. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to earn the privilege, and of course, by then one hopes one has some experience. So this was an incredible early education, and sometime in 1976, there was a performance of Magic Flute, and by this time, after 6 years of me sitting in the pit on a regular basis, other players started bringing their students into the pit. And so this particular performance of Magic Flute, there were 84 people in the pit, and the Met just said, this is ridiculous. And by the way, don't forget, listeners, that Mozart wrote for about maybe 40 if you beef it up. So there's twice as many people in the pit as was necessary for the performance. And the manager just said, this is ridiculous. No more visitors in the pit. But by then, I was a year out of starting Juilliard, year out of starting college. I had received the most perfect early education. I didn't need it anymore.
Well, that's incredible. You're talking about when you're really young with this. A few things. First of all, you said you wanted to be a fireman. Is that right? Well, I mean, that also perhaps proved useful. You've put out many a fire, I'm sure, on stage, I would say.
Well, yes,
I may even recall one or two, maybe. The other thing I can think of is... But if you repeat them, I kill you. At 12 years old, I'm listening to The Police. I'm listening to Toto. I'm listening to stuff like this. You, on the other hand, not only have you been in the pit and the Met, you're having interactions with Dmitri Shostakovich. What is that about?
Well, this is one of the things growing up in New York. My parents had another friend who ran a camera store on 3rd Avenue, camera electronics. And he actually was a Russian emigre from the revolutionary times, so beginning of the 20th century, had originally studied violin with Leopold Auer. Wasn't going to make it playing the fiddle. He was no Jascha Heifetz, unfortunately, but he loved music passionately. And in fact, in his later life, wound up being a quite famous supernumerary at the Met. He was always Roberti in Tosca when, Scarpia shouts, Basta Roberti, with the torturing. And he most famously played the deceased Buoso Donati in Gianni Schicchi, where he spends the opening music in the Zeffirelli production trying to say something and then dies. And he has to lie there in a lump in the bed for the rest of the show. It's pretty funny. Well, not for the rest of the show, but for the next 25 minutes. Al is his name. He kept his Russian connections. And for some reason, every Soviet artist who came to New York in the 60s and 70s made their way to his store. I have no idea why. But the phone would ring and my parents' house, and he'd say, how fast can Andrew get over here? And, it was the other side of town, but still, 30 25, 30 minutes on the crosstown bus. And I met all sorts of really famous Russian musicians this way. But the most famous, of course, was the composer Dmitri Shostakovich. And I had played a couple of his little piano pieces at that point. I'm 12 years old. I had no idea really who this was. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. Somebody snapped the picture. And I can't believe that all these years later, he's become one of my most performed, most favorite, most treasured composers. But I did actually talk to the guy. He didn't speak back. And I saw his eyes, which were like, John, you're old enough to remember the old Coca-Cola bottles with the thick glass on the bottom. His glasses, those round glasses, were so thick that they made his eyes look like they were 1,000 miles away. And that, I think, was part of his personality anyway. He never got close to you unless he really knew you. And from what I gather in subsequent years, it was weird to see that. I'll never forget that. It's like looking at somebody who's standing right next to you, but his eyes were 1,000 miles away. Incredible.
You're big into Shostakovich as a composer as well. And we've recorded some stuff with you recently as well. I'm not even sure if it's out yet or not, but Suites for a Jazz Orchestra.
Hasn't even been edited yet. Yet. With this virus, everything is on hold. So
you introduced me to Shostakovich that I never knew existed, and he obviously was into jazz, appreciated it, did his own versions of it, his own takes on it, and all that. Did you know about that early on, or was your entree into that Shosti 5 and 10 and all the other stuff?
Yeah. No, my entree into real Shostakovich, not just some little piano pieces, was as soon as I became Rostropovich's assistant at the National Symphony when I was 22. And the very first day on the job, he was recording for Deutsche Grammophon Shostakovich 5. And so my very first days of watching his work was one of Shostakovich's great masterpieces. This picture, by the way, is from much, much later. It didn't look like that in 1982, I assure you. But that's in 2003. And it's just, I love this picture because we were very close by then. We'd worked together many times, me conducting him playing solo. But he was such a great mentor, and he's still treating me. And this is, by the way, when he got the Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award in New York. I flew up specially from Dallas to pay tribute to him. He's still talking to me like I'm his kid. Look at that. I love it. It was always the same. And he was a fantastic teacher. People say, how is that possible? Because he wasn't so beautiful to look at as a conductor. He knew better than anybody, because of the thousands of concerts he'd played with conductors, what a conductor should do. Whether he could do it himself beautifully, I don't know. I don't feel like I have the right to even comment on that. But the point was, he would come to my concerts, and he had a very distinctive profile, like Hitchcock almost. And I'd see in the shadows of the first tears, oh my gosh, he's here. And it was always this, oh no, what's he going to say? And he'd come back to the dressing room. He always beat me there. I don't know how. He had much farther to go. And had the most amazingly constructive things to say. And he took the time to say that. And that's why he was a phenomenal teacher. I was going off to make my debut in London with the Royal Philharmonic, and one of the pieces on the program was the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto. I played the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto, as a student. I mean, I knew how the piece went. He spent 2 hours with me on this score. It was like I'd never heard the piece before. It was incredible. So I learned so much from him. And so the entree to Shostakovich was huge, because not only was he Shostakovich's pupil, but also he became his best friend. And so he knew so much about this guy. And occasionally on tour, after a concert, he'd open up and tell me stories that were just remarkable. So I feel like I was privileged not only to watch a great musician, Rostropovich, work on these scores with a wonderful orchestra, the National Symphony, but also then to get background and insight into what was going on in the composer's mind and what he was really like as a person. And just, it's incredible. So that's why maybe I feel so comfortable when I perform Shostakovich, because I feel like I've sort of gotten it from the horse's mouth. So, even though I met him that one time and, of course, was no conductor at the age of 12, didn't know anything intelligent to ask him, I still feel like I touched greatness for that second, but somehow I have felt inspired to carry on that greatness as best I can ever since.
I'm sure that mentorship was key to you becoming the great music director that you are. And I'm curious what you think makes a great music director. I know what does for me, but I don't know that the audience cares about what a drummer in the back of the orchestra thinks. What do you think makes a great music director of an orchestra?
Well, a music director orchestra relationship is like a marriage. And all marriage relationships, good or bad, have ups and downs, and one hopes for the ups. But one of the things that works out with a great relationship is that you figure out a way to make music, in this case, to communicate without even needing to use words sometimes, just gestures as a conductor. Because one thing I really believe in, and with every orchestra I've had the privilege to lead as a music director, is that we perform music without a foreign accent. So if we're in Britain and we're playing American music, it has to sound like an American orchestra. If you're in Sweden playing Elgar, it has to sound like a British orchestra, and so on and so forth. And I think you can really achieve that only successfully if you're a music director and you spend time together and you work out all those little details that ultimately make a great performance. Obviously, as guest conducting is great too, and you come in for the week and everybody's on their best behavior and you have fun and good concert hopefully. It's very different. Your job as a guest conductor is to make the concert as good as possible, but you can't change things. You can't dramatically change things. The whole thing is you have a finite amount of time when you're a guest conductor. If we're lucky in Singapore, we have 3 days, but usually it's more like 2 days. And so during that time, you can't expect to change the way a lot of the sounds are made. What you can expect to do is try and make them work as well within the context of the program. When you're music director, you have a much bigger spectrum of time and development to really work these things so that an orchestra has a certain unique style to every music that they play. And it's trained in, you train that in. And it's really fun. There's no greater sense of pride as a conductor than when you're a music director and your orchestra plays somewhere new and they have a huge success. Like you're a recent father. I'm a father. I mean, that pride, that parental pride, it's the same thing. It's an incredible feeling, and that I'm sorry you don't get as a guest conductor. A guest conductor it's like having a really great date, but a music director, that's a marriage.
We as musicians have our own feelings about that as well. That guest conductors are, of course, like you just said, on the best behavior, and everyone is sort of cordial and gentle and all. You, as our principal guest conductor, have been here several times. Okay, so here you definitely look friendly enough and cordial. Yeah, this is guest conductor right out of the dictionary. That makes sense. Okay, enthusiastic. All right, guest conductor should be demanding. Not sure where we're going here, but okay,
right.
Acceptable.
Well, if I could butt in, this happens to be host planets, and that's I'm telling you the last note of Mars, which is one of the ugliest noises ever written. And at this point, I'm filled with so much rage because the movement is called Mars, the Bringer of War. And it becomes almost like Lee Strasberg method acting. I get so caught up in the rage of the music that I'm sorry about the face, but I'm literally bursting blood vessels.
Don't be sorry, because there's more. Now that is not rage. This, Andrew, is rage.
I love it.
Okay, so and we've crossed the border of angry and rage. I really, at this point, I'm feeling for the the first desk string players here. But
That's aimed at you, John.
so yeah, here you can see I must have missed an entrance or something. I recognize that face, even for out getting a drink or something. I've seen that face up close. I do recognize this one. You need to uphold a certain standard. And in fact, you've talked about like a parent, you want to lift the standards and offer what you can to make things better. You have to eliminate that accent, as you mentioned, of the orchestra. You need to perform as one. But psychologically, that must be a different thing to handle when you come to Singapore, or even when you come to an orchestra with whom you've never worked before.
Yeah. Well, again, when you've never worked with an orchestra before, right at the beginning of my career, when I was in my early 20s, I had somebody say to me, it was a violinist in an orchestra, said, we size you up in the first 5 minutes and we can tell if it's going to be a good week or a bad week. And at first that was incredibly intimidating to a young conductor. And then they suddenly went, well, wait a minute, I can turn this around. I can work it the other way. Like, I'm going to decide in the first 5 minutes whether this is going to be a good week or a long week, And fortunately, they're just about 99% of the time always good weeks. Music is so amazing. And once you learn how to communicate through our gestures, I feel after doing this craft for 38 years, I have sort of some basic knowledge of how to get along with an orchestra. So it's just really fun to just get down to the music making. The one thing we didn't mention about being a music director that's the most important thing is, of course, you have all sorts of, especially in this country, in America, much more responsibility with fundraising, with development, with education, with all sorts of things that you don't have basically anything to do with when you fly in and fly out as a guest conductor. So again, you've bought in a much bigger way to the product, the final product, which is why when it works, I was so happy in my 12 years in Dallas that we started out with an endowment of 19 million. And by the time I left in 2006, it was over 100 million. And that's a lot of meals. But it also was an incredibly satisfying thing to know that I had left the place in much better financial shape than when I had arrived. So as a music director, these are all considerations that go into the pot, really.
What about the difference of directing a symphony orchestra and, let's say, the ballet? You're music director of New York City Ballet, and that has to be different.
It is very different. And what's fascinating about it, John, is my career started when I was 18, first-year student at Juilliard, playing piano solo on stage for Rudolf Nureyev. It was absolutely a fluke that it happened. The person who was hired couldn't do it. Called me at 11 o'clock at night and said, would you do this? And so it was him. It was Nureyev, me, and the piano on stage, Broadway, written up in all the reviews. My career started. It was amazing. And I played for ballet for another couple of years while I was still at Juilliard, and then never again until 2014. I get invited by the New York City Ballet to conduct a production of Coppelia. I thought, sure, why not? I'd been really looking forward to getting a job in New York at some point, and I thought, well, I know they're looking, so let me go see what it's all about. And fortunately, it was a great experience, and I got hired a year later. I started a year later. I wanted the job for a variety of reasons, but the possibly biggest one, and you can appreciate this, John, is the variety of repertoire. The ballet company goes through so much music, and so much music that I didn't know. When I showed up at City Ballet, I knew 3 Stravinsky pieces really well, the same ones you know really well, Firebird, Petrushka, Rite of Spring. We have 23 pieces. Oh, that's Firebird, by the way. You just saw a flash. We have 23 Stravinsky ballets in the active repertoire. And I was like, wow. That alone has been a joy. But learning also all this Hindemith. We do all these world premieres. Just before we closed down, thanks to the virus, got to premiere a new piece by Nico Muhly. It's just such fascinating repertoire. And I've loved the challenge. I really have loved the challenge. And the other thing, of course, I've spent, at that point, 35 years as a conductor, accompanying sound, following sound, as one does when one accompanies you in the Rausch percussion concerto, or when one accompanies a violin soloist, or when one is following a singer in opera. In ballet, you're following sight. And obviously I came to this particularly green, not having ever conducted ballet before 5 years ago. And so it's been a steep learning curve, but I've loved it. The company, of course, is extraordinary. Maybe the best dancers in the world. And so when you're already working with the people at the top, it's your job just not to like embarrass them, make sure they still stay at the top. And I've loved it. I've loved it. The orchestra is tremendous. And every night when I walk into the pit and look up at that curtain and go, okay, we're going to change some lives here. It's a fantastic experience because the New Yorkers love ballet, and it's just it's a real sense of excitement that one feels, palpable excitement from the audience behind you as a conductor. And I love that.
You have your finger in so many pies. New Yorkers also love Broadway.
Yeah.
And you've more than dipped your toes into this too. One of the greatest, I think, not just musical theater, but theatrical creations ever is Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd. Wow, here you are with an idol of mine, Stephen Sondheim, the composer, lyricist. You did Sweeney Todd with the New York Phil. What was that like? Like ballet?
Yeah, no, that was an incredible experience. All I could think of was, as a kid, all those Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland movies, like, hey, kids, let's put on a show. Because literally we all got together on a Sunday, and by Thursday we opened up. And what's funny is Sondheim came to that Sunday first meeting, I think, feeling very skeptical because nobody had ever done, this is the very first time, and now it's very common, but this is the very first time in 2000, May 2000, that somebody actually did this sort of semi-staging of one of his shows. And so the orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, was up on stage in sort of a butterfly pattern with platforms going through the middle of the orchestra and behind, so between me and the audience, and then behind the orchestra. And so there was action all around, and they were in costume. The singers were in costume. It was an amazing cast. It was Patti LuPone, George Hearn, Audra McDonald, Heidi Grant Murphy. It was who I'm forgetting. Neil Patrick Harris. It was like who's who, and actually in some ways, who's who before they were even who they are now. These were people that were either already famous but about to become even more famous, and everybody had such an amazing attitude. There was no ego. It was incredible. So Stephen got really excited when he realized that like this huge assortment of talent had gathered to make this show happen in 4 days, and that's what we did. And so he came the next day with a huge yellow legal pad, and he's furiously scribbling and then giving everybody notes.
That's never good.
So we have no. It's great when the creator. I wish, John, that Mahler could come to one of my rehearsals and go 9-9. It would be so cool. It felt like Mahler was there. He was a guy that I had grown up idolizing. His greatest shows, an amazing theater man. Nothing to me. And then finally, after the dress rehearsal, he comes and says, "Andrew, do you mind if we talk? I have 2 notes for you." I said, "Okay, sure, please." And that's actually the picture you just saw. He said, "I know you can't see it because it's happening directly behind you, but when Sweeney opens up his razor blade, there's a bell tree that goes, which as the light hits the blade, and it goes, I can't do a bell tree, sorry. You're too early." I said, so should I just turn around and watch? He said, "Absolutely. And just turn around so you can see when he opens it and cue the bell tree." And he says, "Here now, my friends," as he's talking about his blades. The second one was really amazing. It's in the second act, Mrs. Lovett sings to Toby, and this was Patti LuPone to Neil Patrick Harris, "No one's going to harm you, not while I'm around." Well, I saw the original cast of Sweeney Todd back in 1970, whatever it is, 5, I want to say. I can't remember. In the intervening years, many people had recorded it, most famously Barbra Streisand, singing it so beautifully to her son in Madison Square Garden. And as a father, I loved the sentiment. No one's going to harm you, not while I'm around. It's like every parent's dream. That, and so I was taking it a slow tempo, a sort of Puccini-esque tempo. He says, "Andrew, you're too slow. It's tension. She wants to kill him. Not only is she's lying. She doesn't not only wants to harm him, she wants to kill him. So you've got to pick the tempo up so we feel that tension. And I said, I'm sorry. I love the song so much. He says, I know. I can see it in your back. And I just like, I'll never forget that as long as I can see it in your back. Anyway, so those are my 2 notes from Stephen Sondheim. I subsequently said to him, Stephen, I'm music director in Dallas. We have a pretty good budget. Write something for me. Anything. Just an overture, something. He says, Andrew, I don't do orchestra. I do theater. Okay.
Well, I mean, Sondheim famously has spoken and written about how a song, a tune, a theme needs to advance the plot, needs to take us somewhere new, which is extraordinary. And he does it in an extraordinarily different, a variety of ways. When you are working on something like Gershwin, another hat you wear, is that just as stimulating and fulfilling for you?
It's a very different form of fulfillment. I adore the music of Gershwin. I make no secret of that. I was born approximately 100 yards from where he lived for much of his life with his brother Ira on Riverside Drive in Manhattan. And I became fascinated by him because we did a show of his at my high school when I was in junior high called Girl Crazy, which of course was the most famous show in a sense that had maybe the most hits per square inch of anything the brothers had written. But not only such amazing hits as Embraceable You, which is one of the great, Biden My Time, I Got Rhythm, which of course introduced then unheard of Ethel Merman to Broadway, and who then became one of the legends. And in the pit was the original Benny Goodman Quartet before they had a career. It was Benny Goodman and Teddy Wilson and Gene Krupa on drums and Lionel Hampton and Jack Teagarden in the brass. It was, the Dorsey brothers were there. This was 1930 New York, and everybody needed work. And because he was George Gershwin, he had the best players in the planet sitting in his orchestra pit. So yes, I would love to have been a fly on the wall during that time, or even, dare I say, an active participant in some way. But I've always been fascinated by Gershwin, and Rhapsody in Blue became a party piece very early on. So why I love it? I love the fact that this guy could write a tune as if he were breathing. It just came out. It's a natural thing. History has shown that there are a number of composers that have had this gift, and there are a number of composers who have not, and have had to struggle for every note they write. But for example, Mozart and Schubert, to name 2, Verdi, who seem their melodies just they seem to just poured out of them. Gershwin was like that, and song after song after song, it just fills you. Even if it's a love song, even if it's sad, it just fills you in the end with joy because there's so much life in his music. And so, yeah, I don't ever want to give up my Mahler and my Rachmaninoff and my Shostakovich, but sometimes you need to smile too, and sometimes you need something that's just uplifting in a, nobody's dead at the end of the piece. It's just and that's well, I mean, that's why I love Gershwin, and I love the joy. One of his childhood friends, Abram Chasins, wrote, George was the only one I ever knew who could make a piano laugh, just laugh. And I love that because it's true. When you play his piano music, there's all these moments where you can just feel the joy. And when you watch the videos that we have of George playing, he's beaming, he's just so happy. So I just love that about his music. There's this sort of a self-effacing charm. I don't know, it's just great.
Well, you have, just for our audience, recorded a little bit of Gershwin as a surprise for people. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. We will say our goodbyes and enjoy the performance. What is it that we're about to see?
Thank you so much, John. Well, this is actually I Got Rhythm from that same show I was talking about, Girl Crazy. It's an arrangement that's actually by the composer. So mostly everything I'm playing after the introduction is exactly what he set down. So give or take a few notes, because I'm, even though I've been practicing during this COVID-19 period, I'm not quite up to my former glory, but hope to get there.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. It's amazing the amount of stuff you do, and it's amazing the depth of knowledge. There are plenty of jack of all trades people, but you really seem to master them all. And it's an honor to have you today, but also to have you with us at the Singapore Symphony so frequently, and looking forward to more times ahead like that.
I am too, John, and I have to say, your orchestra is absolutely splendid. Is superb, as you know, and splendid. I was about to say, they really surprise me every time. I come in with difficult pieces, like beginning of March was Corigliano Red Violin. No way the orchestra played it before, and yet they by the 2 days in sounded like they owned it. This is just really a joy to make music in Singapore, and I hope that we get to do it as planned next time for me in December. I'm just praying that I can actually be there, see you again, and make great music with you and your colleagues.
Well, we at the orchestra miss you. I personally miss you and look forward to that time as well. And I, in New York time, wish you a very late good night. And to our audience, please enjoy Andrew performing I Got Rhythm just for you. Good night, everyone.